Hey, Shalom, Akim, Shalom, Shalom, giving all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh, Bashem Yahushai, Bashem Makakwadash. Double honors to the apostles and the elders of Great Millstone for teaching us his truth, and salutations to the sincere Akim and Akwathim. Listen, may the blessing of election be upon your house. My name is Raquai. I'm back in here with another quick and Lord's will as always an edifying lesson. And for today's lesson, I'm not really sure what I might title this, but I actually just came across this article in regards to the Manosphere, which basically is just a definition of a space where men basically online where they get together and discuss certain I guess beliefs, what makes a man more masculine, essentially to for men to basically improve themselves by improving their fitness, their physique, their outlook, being more disciplined and driven, and as a lot of it also surrounds the bizarre nature of women, right? So I just came across this earlier today, and I just thought I would, just make a couple points on it and actually touch on some of these things and kind of just read through this article here. So it's on the Guardian, .com here, and it says protect men and boys from manosphere influencers. Labor MPs tell Ofcom, right? So I'm guessing there's people that are concerned about a lot of the different rhetoric that is actually being spoken of. But a lot of this, when you look at the true nature of actually what's being spoken of, a lot of it actually comes from the Holy Scriptures, especially when it comes to certain topics and points that a lot of these different influencers make when it comes to women. A lot of it is found in the Holy Scriptures, right? So the importance of patriarchy, ultimately in governed in righteousness, family, the man being the head of the household, right? And that's something that Paul outlines in First Corinthians the 11th chapter, right? There's an order to the family. It's just about establishing a sentiment of order. And what you have in this society, basically, it's it's just disorderly conduct. It's a complete, excuse my French, it's a complete shit show, right? So I just thought, let me just read through this, and I'll insert different precepts and accounts and so on and so forth. And in here it says men and boys need as much protection as women and girls from harmful influencers. And it says the worst parts of the internet. A group of MPs have told Ofcom, as they called for a regulator to give specific guidance onto online platforms. It says more than 60 Labour MPs have written to the Ofcom chief executive, Melanie Dawes, urging her to protect men and boys from the manosphere influencers that may expose them to gambling, extortion, and violent pornography. And that's not something I commonly, have seen, from the different influencers. My only thing is, and this is just my personal opinion, my only thing is that these manosphere guys, they do teach a certain sentiment of having and embracing your masculinity, discipline, actually being more wise when dealing with women, right? And at the same time, my thing is what did they neglect to actually touch on when it doesn't instruct a lot of men when it comes to actually teaching proper values. It doesn't actually teach the importance of actually having a fear of the Lord, right? Because that's really one of the first steps to actually having a sentiment of wisdom, right? Because a lot of these guys, they would say, okay, develop the wealth, the status, acquire lots of women and so on and so forth, but they don't prioritize the importance of actually seeing or discussing, I should say, integrity, charity, values, fear of the Lord, what I'm saying, long suffering, patience, all these different tenets that you read about. That's something that Paul talks about, different fruits of the spirit. These are things that you're not going to find in these manosphere guys, because these people are not very spiritual, but there's a certain aspect of what they discuss which there is some truth to what they're saying. But when it comes to character development, values, Yahushua like values, there is no, you're not gonna get that there, right? So you basically, as the apostles say, you chew the meat and you spit the bones out, basically, right? you know um Here it says the Online Safety Act forced Ofcom to give tech platforms guidance on how to tackle harmful content and activity that disproportionately affects women and girls. But the MPs have argued that men and boys are also targeted in specific ways. Here it says, according to the Gambling Commission, 53% of 11 to 17-year-old boys see gambling adverts online each week, compared to 31% of female peers, while 91 of sextortion victims are male, according to the Internet Watch Foundation. So these people are basically concerned about the kind of content that is being spewed up by these guys, right? And as a matter of fact, let me start with this precept actually, because I actually mentioned the importance of values and so on and so forth, because that's not something you're going to get there. But I actually wanted to touch on some of the things as well, certain talking points that they actually do discuss. Let me start here. This is First Peter's chapter 1. I'm sorry, Second Peter's chapter 1, verse 5, and it says, beside this, giving all diligence, add to your faith virtue, and to virtue knowledge, and to knowledge temperance, and to temperance patience, and to patience godliness, and to godliness brotherly kindness, and to brotherly kindness charity. Right? The scriptures say that the end of all things is at hand, and charity essentially covers a multitude of sins, right? Because it actually, it can be utilized to, because we understand that we're in a condition where we have sinned against our power, right? So we're trying to exemplify certain fruits of the spirit, which is something you don't get from hearing these Manosphere guys, right? Verse 8 here, and it says, for these things be in you and abound, they make you that ye shall either be barren nor unfruitful in the knowledge of our Lord Yahushua Hamashiach, right? So seeing the examples through the scriptures, you actually get an understanding of like, yo man, this is a way how men should conduct themselves. And that's something that King Solomon actually summed up. Let me actually get it. This is Ecclesiastes chapter 12 verse 13, and it says, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Let's fear the Most High, Yahweh B'Shem Shai, keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man, right? So this is pretty much, sums up the what men are supposed to do, right? Is to keep the Lord, keep the commandments, right? And it's essentially his commandments are not grievous, right? That's where you get proper life conduct from. But a lot of these guys, are actually showing themselves to be a lot of the times hypocrites too. Swindlers, grifters, that actually, they might speak very well, but they don't actually uphold a lot of the values that they actually share, say, so on and so forth, right? So I'll kind of just just jump around here and there in the article. Here it says, so I guess there was a documentary that was released. It says here that Alistair Strathern, the MP for Hitchin and the co-chair of the Labour Group for Men and Boys, said that Louis Theroux documentary Inside the Manosphere was another reminder of particular why some of the worst internet can prey on young men and boys. So they're basically just concerned about the kind of content that is actually being pushed out, right? And as a matter of fact, let me get something. there was an account I thought of, you know, because a lot of the things that they discuss sometimes basically surrounds the because scriptures also talk about the wickedness of a woman, right? um I wanted to get an example here, some of the things that they actually do show, because a lot of these tenets that they discuss really goes back to the Holy Scriptures, right? um I wanted to get this account here, you know um because these are some of the things that they're afraid of. And check this out of what David actually did here. This is 2 Samuel chapter 6. Let me see where I can start. Okay, I'll start at verse 16. And it says here, and as the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, Saul's daughter, looked through the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord. And she despised him in her heart. And they brought in the ark of the Lord and set it in place in the midst of the tabernacle that David had pitched for it. And David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord, right? So he was offering up his sacrifices, because at this time now they recovered the Ark of the Covenant. You know what I'm saying? So David basically is in a very joyful, spirit, right? Because he was a king after the Most High's heart. You know what I'm saying? So imagine it, you could kind of picture it in today's terms, like, okay, you had a successful, a wonderful day, and you did a good job, whatever it was, and you come home, right? And this is what you have to deal with, right? And it says, this is verse 18, and it says, and as soon as David made an end to offering burnt offerings and peace offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts. And he dealt among all the people, even among the whole multitude of Israel, as well as the women as men, to everyone a cake of bread, and a good piece of flesh, and a flagon of wine, so that all the people departed, everyone to his house. So he made sure everybody, because at this point he's king, right? So, he made sure, all his subordinates were good. The people were good. They were taken care of, so on and so forth, right? Now, check this out. This is verse 20. And then David returned to bless his household, and Michal, the daughter of Saul's, right? This is one of his wives, right? I believe she is the first wife, if I'm not mistaken. And Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David and said, "How glorious was the king of Israel today, who uncovered himself today in the eyes of the handmaids and his servants, as one of the vain fellows shamelessly uncovered himself." So she had a strong discontent for the way David, danced for the Lord, after recovering the Ark of the Covenant, right? So this is a moment of celebration David was feeling, right? So imagine, like, I'm just picturing it into today's terms, because in today's terms and in today's society, a lot of men, especially Israelite men, they have to deal with living with a woman, and essentially her having a very strong what's the word I'm looking for, a strong distaste for her man, especially, that's one of the things a lot of these men on this manosphere complain about, is that they might be in a very good mood, and because the man might be in a very good mood, and because the woman wasn't the cause of that very good mood, they feel the need to destroy that man's mood by kind of dampening it. And that's something, and that's why a lot of these men, resort to these different platforms, because they don't feel like they can fully be like themselves. So now it gives a little bit more understanding to a lot of the things that Solomon spoke about, how, like, okay, it's better to dwell at the housetop or to dwell with the dragons or something like that, rather than to actually dwell in the house of a brawling woman, because that actually paints a certain kind of sentiment of why you, a king, would write something like that. You know what I'm saying? That would have access to all these different women, all these different wives and concubines, would write something like that. Because a lot of the women, they provoke a man to his distress, and that's one of the things a lot of men don't want to deal with. They just want to come home to a space that is peaceable, that is warm, is friendly, and these are certain key characteristics that a lot of our women do not have and do not know how to exemplify. And it's mostly a lot of the heathen women, ironically, that actually exemplify this, because they come from a culture where there's an importance in manhood and family and understanding what the role of the father does. You know what I'm saying? As opposed to our families, which is predominantly run by a lot of single mothers. So you see the end result of that, right? So let me not lose myself. This is so check this out. This is what David said to Michal, right? So it says here, and David said unto Michal, it was before the Lord Yahweh, which chose me before thy father and before all his house, to appoint me ruler over the people of the Lord, over Israel. Therefore will I play before the Lord, and I will yet be more vile than thus, and I will be base thine in mine own sight. And of the maidservants which thou hast spoken, of them shall I be in honor. Therefore the Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child until the day of her death. Right. So, basically David had a moment where he had to, respectfully, he had to check her, because he was in a very pleasing mood, and she was trying to basically dim his celebration, dim his mood, right? What's that Kendrick song where he says bitch don't kill my vibe, right? That's that's the kind of mentality David had, right? And that's that's one, I should say, of the talking points that is strongly discussed amongst the Manosphere, right? So that's a lot of these. So going really back to the point, a lot of these things, they get there when you go to the root, because a lot of the things they would say, is really radical, which is really not. It's really not that radical, but when you go into the word radical, it really just goes back to the roots of something. So I just went to etymology here online, and it says here, radical in the etymology, it says originating in the root or ground. It says vital for life, radicalis in the Latin, having roots, root, branch, root. It says going to the origin, essential. And what's our origin as the Israelites is you find that in the Holy Scriptures. You find the ways of our forefathers. As a matter of fact, let me get that next. One second. Job 8. Let me see. Because that's what the scriptures actually bring you to is remembering the ways of your forefathers. This is Job chapter 8 verse 8, and it says here, for I inquire, I pray thee of the former age, and prepare thyself to the search of their fathers. Right. So this is what's bringing us back to our understanding of who we are as a people. Knowing who we are, knowing that we're a nation of kings and priests, and and princesses, right? Knowing that we're not just filthy degenerates, right? And that brings back a certain type of that reinvigorates, I should say, a certain level of masculinity. And in this society, that's what Esau is really striving to do, is to destroy not just the family, taking the man. Okay, that's one of the things he did, taking the man, incentivize having a man outside of the household, destroying the nuclear family, and basically having the women upholded on a pedestal, and basically being at variance to the man, and not seeing the importance of, those children that come from that union, having those children be very important in the lives of that, in those lives, including their fathers, if that makes sense, right? Having the children, um basically having a relationship with their fathers. That's basically what I wanted to say, right? Because we see that that's what's strongly lacking. I want to get two more examples actually as well. This is something I also wanted to get. I wanted to get this here. This is but this is another aspect of something that a manosphere also, discusses. This is Luke chapter 2, verse 46 here, and it says, "And it came to pass, and after 3 days they found him in the temple," speaking about Yahushua, "sitting in the midst of doctors, both hearing them and asking them questions. And they that heard him were astonished and at his understanding and answers. And when they saw him, they were amazed. And his mother said unto him, Son, why hast thou dealt with us? Behold, thy father and I have sought thee sorrowing. And he said unto them," Yahushua speaking, "How is it that ye sought me? Wist ye not that I must be about my father's business?" And they understood not the saying which he spake unto them. So essentially, even had moments where he had to check his mother, right? So, it really, this is another aspect of the masculinity that is basically withered away in this society, right? Because this is really a queendom. It's not really a kingdom. You know what I'm saying? You just have wicked men, in rulership that are allowing these things, and that trickles down onto the people. That trickles down onto the officers, as the scriptures say as well. As is the king, so are his officers, right? So that vibration that is pushed from the top, it trickles down onto the everyday people, because and it shows that they just allow these kinds of behaviors, and when they allow these things, it creates a society of men that are weak. So for example, if you were somebody who was righteous, you would be getting rid of adult overly sexual content. You wouldn't be allowing that within your people. But Esau is the type of person that destroys his people, as the scriptures say, an unwise king destroyeth his people. Because really, these different tactics, such as overly sexual content, on these different sites, is really to destroy the man and take away and make him docile, make him weak, make him effeminate, make him make him a woman worshiper, basically, right? So I'm reading these things to kind of to show you the roots of where a lot of these talking points actually come from, right? And the last thing I actually wanted to discuss, I mentioned the role of the importance of actually having a father within the household. And that is something a lot of our children don't get, because Esau is going back to what Esau has done. He has destroyed the nuclear family, so the children don't actually get a proper, rich understanding of not just their culture, but they also don't get proper guidance. So they essentially start to become menstruous. They become a bunch of monsters. They become a bunch of the term they use these days is YNs, because they're unruly. They're basically like wild bulls caught in a net, right? So here it says, let me get this. And I just wanted to, bring this account as well, just to show the importance of actually, having a father within the household, and this, it really goes back to proper instruction, fearing the Lord, right? So this is Tobit chapter 4. I'll start at verse 1. And I'll just read down to verse 5. And it says, "And in the day Tobit remembered the money which he had committed in Gibeah in rages of Media, and he said with himself, I have wished for death, wherefore do I not call for my son Tobias, that I may signify to him of the money before I die. And when he had called him, he said, My son, when I am dead, bury me, and despise not thy mother, but honor her all the days of thy life, and do that which shall please her, and grieve her not." Right? So basically going back to the instructions, because when you go back into our culture, we're supposed to honor our mothers and our fathers, right? Here it says, "Remember my son, wherefore she saw many dangers for thee when thou was in her womb, and she was dead. Bury her by me in one grave. My son, be mindful of the Lord Yahweh Bashim Shai all thy days, and let not thy days be set to sin." And what is sin? Transgression of the law. This is an aspect of a lot of these Manosphere guys they don't actually touch on and discuss, because for them, okay, you can focus so much on actually trying to acquire the bag and so on and so forth, but they don't actually have any any works when it comes to righteousness. The scriptures say that riches don't even profit in a day of wrath, but righteousness can deliver from death. And this is one of the things that you heavily see within this particular book. So going, really speaking on Tobit here, right? Very, very good story. But the point is, with these Manosphere guys, yes, they do touch on a lot of points in regards to when it comes to women and family and having essentially the custody to raise their children. But this is a society where, basically the state is in between the mother and the father, right? The women are incentivized to actually get divorced because, for them, there is a reward if they do so. There is a reward for breaking, I don't want to say breaking wedlock, but for breaking up that union, right? So, here it says, going back to, this is verse 4. I'm sorry, verse 5. And it says, "My son, be mindful of the Lord Yahweh Bashim Shai, our power all the days, and let not thy will be set to sin, or transgress his commandments, and do uprightly all thy life long, and follow not the ways of unrighteousness." So a lot of these guys, they may have some good talking points, they may speak well, but a lot of these guys, when it comes to, proper understanding of maybe like history, especially for you Israelites who watch these guys, man, like, you're not gonna get that kind of information from these guys, right? Yes, they have their shtick, they talk about, that's their different platforms, so on and so forth. But when it comes to actually understanding who you are, your culture, really, you really were just gonna get that from the servants, the prophets, right? That's why the prophets, they're basically like fathers unto the fatherless nation, right? So here it says, "Do uprightly all thy life long, and follow not the ways of unrighteousness," right? So, I just wanted to touch on that. I didn't really read the article too much, because, they basically are just trying to shame a lot of these men for actually having a platform and basically kind of speaking, freely, because, and that's one of the things that the society does, is really dim the vibration of the man, especially the Israelite man. They try to dim that vibration, and it's basically trying to castrate you, right? You can't speak, and there were moments when Yahushua even spoke with authority, and you can't do that. You can't use rude speech. You can't feel a sexual attraction to a woman, that is actually at marriageable age. And there's probably a lot more that I'm probably not even thinking of right now, but you're basically, your balls are really cut off in this place, especially, and even in the physical sense, like, you can't really have the amount of seed that you actually want, what I'm saying, because it's a threatening thing if a man has more than one wife, right? But here it is, you have a society where a lot of women are now complaining that they don't have any husbands, which all that is scriptural anyway, because it says it in Ezra's, women shall mourn having no husbands. But this is not a society that's thriving properly, right? And people don't see the importance of these things. So, anyways, I've rambled on quite a long, but I just wanted to share those things and get this off my chest. But the Lord's will, this was quick and edifying. Just like to give all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh Bashem Shai. Until next time, I say Shalom.